The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay. Are we on? Good morning, everybody, both here in the room in Loughborough and the hundreds of people following us online all over the world. Actually, how many people do we have with us, Bernie?
At the moment, there's just 5.
Just 5 people, okay. Oh, 8. We've just gone up to 8, okay. Yesterday, we had around 25 to 30 people engaging with us in the morning. So this is just to say a big welcome to anyone that is following us on the internet. We do very much value your participation in this event. If you do have any questions, then please do use the question feature within the GoToWebinar, and we will incorporate those questions alongside those from the audience here today, here in Loughborough in the UK. So to welcome everybody to the second day of the 7th LCEDN Annual Conference. We had a really fascinating day yesterday, focused around the whole question of what we mean by transforming energy access, and we had that addressed from a whole range of different perspectives in the different sessions that we went into. Just one quick announcement at the start. I was asked to introduce John Lane. Could you stand up, John?
Sure.
John is the program manager, program director. Is that the right? Both. He's the head honcho, the big guy for the Carbon Trust on the Transforming Energy Access Program, the RPDC, the Research Program Development Consortium for the Transforming Energy Access Program. So if you do have any further questions about the program as it's developing, then do come and talk to John. Just with us today now? You're not staying? Yeah, he's just with us for today. He was with us all day yesterday as well. So this session today, we move on to consider one of the kind of central themes of the idea of transforming energy access, which is to do with innovation. Clearly, for us to transform in the kinds of ways that we were talking about yesterday, technology and technological innovation are massively important, but so too are innovations in the way in which energy is governed, the way in which different organisations conceive of the change that they're trying to produce. So this is going to be a session where we look directly at some of the issues surrounding what we might mean by innovation and what's happening within particular innovation spaces. So the first 2 presentations we're going to have this morning focus specifically on a topic that was mentioned on several occasions yesterday, which is energy storage. We're then very, very happy to have with us participating from across the Atlantic, Lucy from CrossBoundary, who will introduce the work that they're doing in the innovation space across Africa. And then finally, we'll also have Peter Robbins with us, who's going to be looking at things from a slightly more broader understanding of what innovation might mean. So we're going to have about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes to see, just slightly changing it now. I've got people who are looking very worried at the front now. No. We have an hour and a half, so obviously we'll try and move to questions at the end of all of the presentations, if that's okay. So I'm now very pleased to call on my colleague Upul from the chemistry department here to say a few words around the energy storage research.
So it is a quick one, and all I wanted to do is basically make some provocative statements, if you like, or less or higher, depending on the degree of provocation that you want to do, and then throw those ideas to the floor, and then start discussion from then onwards, right? So that's Right. So first of all, I must say that I'm a chemist. I'm somebody who would go to the labs and with a bunch of people and then do things, try to do things, and expecting some miracles, and then sometimes it works, and often it doesn't work, and frustration, and etc., etc. But that hasn't come. Whereas people who, like Jonathan here, who are experts in this, and I'm sure he will deliver a more sophisticated presentation for the occasion. Am I doing the right thing? Clicking this. It doesn't move though.
Let me start the flashing pink box.
Great. I think that you guys must have discussed these things a lot yesterday, and then there's no need for me to pitch, but just to set the scene. These are the things that we need to deal with: the population growth, expansion, cities, and reducing energy demands, and the change of lifestyles. And we are more energy hungry today, and it will be more and more tomorrow as our next generation take the batons from us. And we had to deal with lots of underdeveloped grid infrastructure, some reliability issues, and these are not just necessarily the suburbs of urbans as well. To remind sometime in the cities, people are now more relying on off-grid or more preferred off-grid situations because of reliability, and you can guarantee that you get the power. This is in fact happening in urban environments as well. Or if you're familiar with places like Pakistan and some of the places, for example, you only get electricity from main grid for about a few hours per day, 2 to maximum 4 hours per day, so limited capacity. And then obviously developments and some of the regulation issues, obviously we have to deal with. We're blessed with PV, wind, and hydro. They're all renewable resources, and that is the beauty of the territories that we are focusing on this event, which is good. But they all are intermittent sources, so we need energy storage solutions. Some creators around us know how to do this, much far better than us. And they've been doing this for many, many years, but we still learn how to do this, and that's the truth. When it comes to options, you can categorize in different ways: mechanical, electrochemical, and electrical, and thermal, and something called hydrogen-related. Or I would name this slide differently. So this is a shade. If you can't see this properly, probably when you circulate the slides, you might see a better version. So what it is basically, the different technology types comes in the different territories in terms of transmission and distribution and support the grid, and then responsive services or bulk power management. And here you can see the module sizes, and then the discharge times. Now, this is quite important, and this is being discussed in many projects, and we know this how important this is in different scenarios. This is a quite old slide, and you can see where the technology readiness level from R&D to demonstrations and deployments to commercialization. This is about 4 years back, but things, I guess, may have moved this direction in this whole curve. And plus, some of the new technologies that come into play, I'm sure. Now, these are coming from more commercial sector. People think that by 2025, the growth of the capacity growth of storage, 80 gigawatt, and this is forecast, and we're seeing all this forecast, but clearly it's going in this direction. And we're somewhere here, so it's basically going to go up and steep, and then curve is going to be more steep, and then further up. So there are some new scenarios coming into this as well, which is going to affect this more importantly. So the demand driven by the grid support and resiliency and integration. So for variable renewable generation. So this would significantly change this new scenario as well. And now, if you take various technologies, you can come again, as I said, electrochemical and then mechanical and electrical and so on, and different electrical and electrochemical so on. But one of the key focus on many ongoing projects, the batteries. Although I would view slightly differently, I'll come back to it in a minute. So depending on the types of batteries, technology of battery chemistry. As a chemist, I should use the word chemistry. But chemistry, your power, the module size and the discharge time varies. And this is quite important because at least I know 2 or 3 scenarios that until people, when you write proposals, we have a specific timelines and we put together, okay, let that sit or whatever quickly into a proposal, and then when you actually test this in the real world situation, we realize that actually what we designed and planned for is not really working in the real world. And that's where this come into play, because you need to have we need to have significant consideration as to the chemistry, existing chemistry, as well as what new chemistry can offer in different scenarios. Because it's 15 minutes, I won't go too much into details, but you can see the situation today and then by 2020, how this double arrow bar interface with different situations of technologies, from research to development to demonstration to deployment to mature technology. And clearly, we often hear, okay, this is lead acid established and it's proven technology and you can buy it, whatever the capacity is. A bit bulky, but it works, etc., etc. But it is not the case, unfortunately. And then when you design a system or a device, and an awful lot of things to consider, starting from cost to lifetime to discharge, and then disposal, and then all the other environmental factors, recyclability, reliability, and safety as well. I think we all experienced the lithium battery cycle that went through as a thermal runway recent in the last couple of years. So to remind ourselves, if you take a lithium-ion battery, it's two, basically you have 3 key components, anode, cathode, and the electrolyte, and then the processes governed by this for charge and discharge is key to the reliability and all the factors that I mentioned in the previous slide. And equally, jump this equally for lead acid. If you take lead acid, again, the chemistry and non-cathode chemistry and recyclability is key to deliver the different aspects that we discussed. And then when you go to high energy power axis and then the high voltage axis, you get the high power, high energy, and then you end up with all these different scenarios in terms of thermal management and in terms of material safety and cost and so on. It's a complicated situation. Okay, so what I thought is probably because the lead acid and the lithium ions are the key favorites in the deployment in many projects, in ongoing projects, and hope and I believe that the other projects that are being planned is still being considered. Just to give you a quick overview of these 2 technologies, the gel and flooded scenario of lead acid versus lithium, you could see that the charge window is degradation is significant, and also then the life cycle life you reflect that very clearly, and the temperature stability against temperature. So these are very important in the deployment process because we are dealing with tropical countries, and then the temperature from one place to another significantly change. Plus, in the night scenario and then day scenario, there's a significant fluctuation if you take places like Nepal and then North India and then quite a few other places. So it's important. And then again, this is I would won't go too much into this because it's same. So if you take, now there's something we can learn from a little bit, I would say, to find out some key tools or key toolkits for deployment for batteries and then battery-related storage devices. It comes, although I discuss mainly batteries, it comes to batteries, supercapacitors, and supercapacitors. This is what you call a new device. You combine supercapacitor electrode and the battery electrode, which provide both energy, high energy and or moderate energy and moderate power. And it is a new concept which we currently studied or maybe even tested. On the transport scenario, you can see for we have a clear-cut toolkit, and this is a target set by USABC. But the red line describing a couple of years ago where we were. So there's a long way to go on the lifetime, on the specific energy density, and then this price and so on. But when it comes to off-grid, mini-grid, microgrid, the things that we're familiar with, and we do not have that toolkit. And that's what I want to say. We do not, as far as I know, we haven't thoroughly considered this toolkit and different scenarios and different geographical scenarios. I think that is something we need to consider in planning future projects, and especially when integrating the technology. We have to have that toolkit. Then we can see the wide scenario and then look at different technologies. Quickly remind the situation of the lithium ion. So you can see the temperature and then what can happen if you raise temperature of the lithium ion battery system. So you could have thermal runaway up to here, and then active material breakdown. If you're seeing the electrodes decompose and electrode falling apart, and that's of lithium ion batteries, and this is because of these scenarios. Again, in the worst cases, you end up with this, and obviously none of us want to deal with that. Okay, so this is our safe window for lithium-ion battery. If the geographical locations that we're dealing with go sort of away from this window, temperature window, and then definitely we need something else. Lithium-ion doesn't work in that, and equally for individual cells. Obviously, this is this individual cell voltage, and depending on cell voltage, you get your compound, which I discussed in the previous slide, change. For example, you need ionic liquids for large electrochemical windows, but again, they have their own pros and cons and so on. And this is again to quickly highlight the cycle life and temperature. Right? I'm not going to go into too much detail with lead acid battery, something very widely studied, but it fails and significantly on the low power, longer period. Just briefly tell you what it is. That in a motor vehicle, we have something called alternative motor. So the alternative motor constantly charged lead acid battery. So therefore, although the battery is sitting next to a very high temperature component, which is the engine, not too far from engine, it works fine, and then hence you say, okay, why not? Why can't it operate in 50 degrees and somewhere north of Delhi? No, it's not, because in the stretching scenario, you don't have a constant charge, and you have to have long wait, and the discharge rate is very slow, and then until you get the sun back on the following day. So these are real issues. So after considering this, and we are currently working on something called the JUICE hardware through the Industrial Challenge Funds with UCL and Southampton and Birmingham, some colleagues, to come up with various energy storage technologies, electrochemical and electrical, combining. Our focus at the moment is more sort of aqueous type electro cells, not lead acid. And another project we recently worked with Ed here. We put the technology at the heart of this the EBL Hub project, which is led by OU, especially for some reason you can't see WP1. Sorry. So we put the heart of energy storage as the WP, and then generation and the management as the heart of this project, because it's such an important thing, the technology, and then adapting technology to the scenarios that we were. So I'm not going too much in this. I already passed my time. I think few things I would say. Off-the-shelf solutions do not always have answers. Everything that I said is useless now. So it's a classic. So do not always have answers, unfortunately. So please consider the power of the science and technology and innovation, because you shouldn't ignore that. And also, I heard in many scenarios and in many discussions that within 2-3 years you can't deliver, and then there's so many issues there, and then we need to find something that currently you can buy and then provided with guarantee or warranty, etc., services. But it is not the case, and also it is an opportunity for us to work with an enormous amount of skill sets in those countries, and people are prepared to willing to work with us on R&D and in various aspects. And there's so much opportunity. I think we shouldn't really forget that, and use us as a power, and then use as a tool to look at new solutions. And then every single opportunity when we have, we use that opportunity. And finally, if you don't take risk, and if you just say that let's go safe issue, there won't be any rewards. And I was saying that in many occasions. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Upul. As I said before, we'll take questions at the end. So without any further ado, I'll pass on to Jonathan.
Okay, thanks. Great, thanks, Ed. And good morning, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak here. Very pleased to have made it today. So sorry I haven't been able to join you for the yesterday or tomorrow. It's the joys of half term. But it did mean that I got to see the breadwinner yesterday with my 2 children, so totally recommend that. And I couldn't think of a link into the talk from the breadwinner, but maybe a bit towards the end, because it is set in Kabul, which has got some issues around living in a city that might be relevant. Anyway, once we get this, okay. So I'm Jonathan Radcliffe. I'm at the University of Birmingham, where I lead the energy systems and policy analysis group, and there's a few of the team here today, and you'll see a picture of the team at the end, so you can go and harangue them if you want any further details. But I'm going to think about energy storage again a bit from a sort of systems perspective, and linking the technology into that sort of system integration piece. So there's a couple of diagrams that are quite similar, so if you came a bit late, you might have missed them. You'll get to see them again. So I'm going to pick up a couple of projects that we've run in the past or are running at the moment around looking at Brazil and Mexico, which we've got ongoing, and mention a new Institute for Global Innovation that's been established at Birmingham, and I'm leading the Resilient Cities team. So my background is as a physicist, having trained a few years ago in that field. I've worked in policy most of my career, and now came to academia about 5 years ago. So it's about linking the technology into policy and systems that I think is really critical. So seeing that sort of big picture that I'll touch on during the talk. I'll start off with some view of the energy system in the UK that we're maybe a bit more familiar with. So on the left-hand side is the total primary energy supply for the UK, and on the right-hand side is the fuel used for electricity generation. So the key thing is to think about the difference between electricity and energy. That's important. and most of the energy that we use is for transport and heating, and this partly also for generation of electricity. But just think about, when we're trying to decarbonise energy, especially, it's more than just think about renewable electricity generation. Just think about what do we use the energy for. And you can see another thing is the sort of historic trends in the UK is of sort of gradual decline or plateau over the last few years. After a century or more of increasing demand, it's begun to drop down a bit due to energy efficiency measures in part. And you can see that this is a bit out of date because the electricity generation from coal is now dropped off a cliff face and has been mostly replaced by gas, and a bit of an increase in renewables. So comparing that with Brazil, where there's still a rapid increase in demand for energy and electricity alongside that. You can see a lot of the energy for oil, for transport, and a lot coming from biofuels, given the location, and in terms of electricity generation, a lot coming from hydro. And there's some massive dams that you can find in the country there. But there's a big increase in demand from economies like Brazil that are expanding. And there's a limit to the amount that can be provided by hydro in terms of the availability of land to do that, and the environmental consequences, and some of the climate change impacts, maybe reducing the amount that can come from hydro. Anyway, so they've been looking to see what other fuels can meet that demand, and wanting to do that in a sustainable way. And think about the energy consumption in the two countries. So, as I say, a lot of our demand in the UK is for heat due to the climate, for transport, and a fairly small proportion for other uses, for appliances, for example. And just looking at the Brazilian residential sector, you can see here actually there's a massive demand for air conditioning, again driven by the need for cooling in the houses, but also for hot water. And a lot of that is driven by sort of people having showers at a particular point during the day. And so if you have a look at just the electricity demand profiles, so in the UK, in the winter, it's a bit higher. This is over the course of one day, so it's quite low at night, then picks up with a peak around about tea time, and then drops back off in summer. It's just a bit lower. In Brazil, the demand is actually higher than in the winter because people are cooling, and there's also a different sort of profile as people tend to have a shower in the afternoon, and a lot of that water is heated up by electricity. So we've got quite different uses of energy, and that really should shape how we think about different technologies that can be integrated into those systems. And over the longer term, so this is looking out through the 2030s in the UK, and how we're going to decarbonise electricity. This is the carbon intensity dropping to almost zero by 2030, and you'll be familiar with how we're going to phase out coal, reduce the role for gas, and have a big increase in renewables and potentially nuclear. So that's really changing the sort of mix of electricity generation from one which is very dispatchable in terms of thermal generation to one which is much less easily or less flexible in terms of being able to switch on and off, if we have solar or wind or nuclear. So in both cases, but we see a growing need for flexibility within the energy system. and that's going to get much more acute as we move towards 2050. So we'll need we're going to have a change in demand in terms of how people use energy and change in how it's supplied. And both those put pressures over different timescales from a few seconds. If we can imagine maybe a cloud coming over and turning off some PV, or there's a variability in the supplies and the frequency of electricity affecting the power quality, out through to minutes as we get, say, gusts of wind, or hours as different weather systems come through or changes in demand happen, out through to days and months, and especially thinking about the sort of annual cycle where we've got a much bigger demand for energy in the UK during the winter because of the need for heat, which is maybe 3 or 4 times that for electricity. So we see big variability in the energy system, supply and demand. And with the move towards renewables, we're going to need some different tools to allow us to manage that. And so that's a sort of context for the UK and decarbonisation. If we look more globally, there are other challenges to reduce environmental impact, maybe in terms of the sort of natural capital, improving reliability in systems, lowering costs, increasing access being very important, and greater urbanisation. And one I'll just mention quickly here is a forecast for increasing electrical demand for cooling compared to heating, as a lot of the global south gets more prosperous and looks towards improving comfort levels in those countries. So a bit of work that we're doing at Birmingham is looking at smarter ways of delivering cold. So you've seen this. There's from the previous talk, what we can see storage as being a way of managing that variability on the system, and there's lots of different technologies, both from electricity storage, but also think about thermal storage as well. So if we're trying to deliver heat or meet a demand for heat or cooling, then we should be thinking about thermal storage just as much as for electrical storage. I'll skip through these barriers to deployment, but think about on the basis of that and their analysis of what we looked at in Brazil, we can think about the different sorts of systems that we're trying to manage, whether it's large-scale electricity supply, or maybe it's renewable integration in remote areas, providing greater access to electricity or energy, and that shapes the sort of storage technology that might be appropriate for that system. So it's not thinking about, again, as the previous speaker said, it's not about taking an off-the-shelf solution, it's thinking about what we're trying to deliver. And we're taking that through into a new project that we're looking at in Mexico, that's funded through the Newton Fund Institutional Links project, where we're working with partners at the National Energy Institute in Mexico in Cuernavaca to see how energy storage can help provide greater social benefits to a location. So we've just kicked this off as a feasibility study, working with the team there, and we'll be using an approach called multi-criteria decision analysis to think about the wider benefits from putting in technologies. So it's not just about reducing the costs of electricity, but think about, well, people need access to water, and if we put in a pump, then that can provide greater social benefits to the population there. So think about the wider implications of increasing access as one potential case study. So you can see the team here who are working at the moment to look to find a case study that will be looked at in more detail over the next year. And you can find details at on our website, and if you get the slides, you'll be able to click on this link and go to a blog post that tells you a bit more about the project. So I'll just finish now with a couple of slides on the Institute for Global Innovation, that launched a few weeks ago. I'm leading the Resilient Cities theme. So this is a new initiative by the university. We had a launch event and this nice diagram that was written. Again, you'll be able to find that in more detail on our website. But we're thinking about how cities, especially in low middle income countries, can respond to or prepare for shocks or trauma events that they experience, and think about what it means to prepare in a resilient fashion for that, and what resilience means in those situations, and taking a very whole systems approach. So partly it's about infrastructure, but just as importantly, it's about the economy and how that will respond, about the community, in terms of maybe religious groups, for example, or the different institutional structures that can set the policy framework for this at different scales, local or national scale, or the environment, or the sort of health consequences for people. So it would be taking a very multidisciplinary approach. So final slide. So energy storage represents a range of energy system services that could be important. There are different technologies across scales, and the choice of technology should reflect that wider system need and indeed the context in which you're putting that technology into. So I'll just leave you there, and thanks to the team and our sponsors. I look forward to any questions later. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think one of the things I'm really enjoying about this session is that we are, sometimes I think we can tend to over-focus on the rural, and which is obviously a massively important part of the work that we are doing as the Low Carbon Energy for Development Network. But I think it's really interesting that in these couple of presentations, firstly is we are the Low Carbon Energy for Development Network, and I think actually looking at those debates in relation to carbon as well as in relation to energy poverty is really important. And I'm really excited, I think, by some of the attempts to bring together different groups of people working on this issue of energy storage from very different purposes and perspectives. So I think it's been a really interesting start to the day's activities. I'm really glad that we can see Lucy over there. We can now see you, Lucy. Hi. Everyone in the room. So can I ask everyone in the room to say a big hello and a wave to Lucy?
Thanks, everyone.
Lucy, could you say hello, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
No, hang on. We can't hear you yet, Lucy. We're just getting there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone.
We're just turning the volume up a little bit, Lucy.
No, we need that presentation.
Okay. Okay, brilliant. So, Lucy, we're really pleased that you could join us. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to you to say what you want to say to us. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. So, hi, everyone. I'm Lucy Shaw. I work at a company called CrossBoundary, which is an investment advisory firm by trade that focuses on emerging and frontier markets and how we can get private capital in for economic development. And at CrossBoundary, we have a lot of experience in energy on the continent through our advisory work, and we also run an investment fund for solar projects across Africa. And we recently launched an energy access team as well, which focuses predominantly on mini-grids today. And I'll explain a bit about how mini-grid innovation fits into the broader energy access piece before launching into how we've approached mini-grid business model innovation in the field in Africa. So a little bit different from the innovation approaches we've had so far, but hopefully still of interest to the group. So the Mini-Grid Innovation Lab exists really to improve the energy access for people in Africa who don't have access to it yet. And the reason we're focusing on mini-grid business model innovation is we think mini-grids are currently stuck in a cycle of doom, if you like. So there isn't a strong business model for mini-grids. The rural consumers don't spend enough to justify the capital cost of connection. And at the same time, there's no scalable access to finance in the sector that's allowing companies to put more mini grids in the ground at scale and get the benefits of scale. And then thirdly, government support for the mini grid sector is generally lacking. There are some parts of the continent that are really promoting it, but most parts of the continent in Africa don't have strong government support or clear government support for the mini grid sector. And so we're trying to work on this first piece of the puzzle with the Innovation Lab, where we're proving the unit economics of mini grids to ensure that they're more sustainable and able to provide power to more people. So what the lab is effectively a research and development fund for developers to test ideas that they have for improving their business model in the field, and then build the evidence base from the data collected on how those tests go, and broadcast that to the sector for supporting investment into mini grids. And so, as high-level objectives for the lab, we want to improve the capability of mini grids to provide energy access in Africa. And the main outcomes we're targeting are any innovation that allows more consumption per person, reduces the cost to serve people, or increases the addressable market of mini grids is in scope for us. So the tagline here is more power, more people, less cost. And then the tangible targets we have for this year, we want to be testing 4 prototypes at least in 2 to 3 different countries. We want to have developers adopt and scale up at least 1 to 2 of these prototypes, and then scale up the lab through to 2019 and beyond so that we can test more business model innovations. In terms of how the lab is different from previous approaches, we think there are 3 things that make it different and exciting to do this kind of work. So one is that it's developer-led. We work with developers to understand their priorities for testing, what they think will make or break their mini grid business model, and then we implement these prototypes in field with them and work with them to do this through to the end. We also collect a lot of data on what we're doing, so we collect data before, during, and after prototypes so that we can really understand the impact on the business model and also on the people in these communities of doing these prototypes for mini grids. And then thirdly, our approach is iterative. We feel like great ideas sometimes they're great, but when you put them in the field, they fall down. And so we try and come up with these great ideas, but make our approach iterative and adaptive to the results that we're seeing in field, and changing this approach as necessary with developers. In terms of how this works in practice, the steps that we go to do this, we identify a business model gap with mini grid companies. So as an example, one of our prototypes is appliance financing. And appliance financing is designed to increase the revenue per customer by giving them access to an appliance on credit. They then have an appliance that they otherwise wouldn't have, and they're using more power. That's the hypothesis we had. And then we're now testing that in field. So developers have sold these appliances to customers on credit without any credit checks, nothing more than 6 months worth of billing history is required to receive an appliance. And then we're collecting data on that and how that's going to work in practice. So data on their repayments, data on the consumption change, and data on the costs of delivering a program like this. We're collecting this data live, so every month we get new data feeds on this, but we also get feedback from developers on how this is progressing, so we can change it if necessary. And then at the end of the project, we'll evaluate it fully and figure out, does this business model make sense? Is it actually increasing consumption at the site? And is it costing developers less to implement than the benefits of doing this? And if so, this should be scaled up across the sector, and we'll tell as many people in the sector as possible that this is the case. So we partner with E4I, which is Energy for Impact, to implement these prototypes. We also are supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, and our primary partners are developers themselves, so working with them and testing these in field. So some of the ideas we've been thinking of, or that developers suggest, could be as broad as irrigation and cold chain, electric vehicles, internet cafes, main grid integration, blockchain, if that is a priority for them. But the point is that developers suggest ideas to us, and then we implement what we think, what they think, and what we validate will have the most impact on the business model of a mini grid, whether it's growing revenues, reducing cost, or increasing the addressable market. The reason we're able to quantify the impact so well of what we're doing is because we have such strong access to data with developers. So we're collecting data currently in 3 countries, and we're collecting these for over 2,000 customers across 15 sites, more than 15 sites, and we're getting smart meter data, so it's hourly or sometimes every 15 minutes. We're collecting data on the consumption of every customer at every site. And we're able to match this with our experiments or the prototypes, so with people who receive an appliance versus people that don't, to understand what the impact is of a particular prototype. So with this data, we're able to do a lot. We're looking at things like power quality and the downtime of mini grids versus the downtime of the main grid to understand whether they're more reliable. And based on some preliminary analysis, they are. We're looking at how customers cluster in different parts of the mini grid. We're looking at what kind of appliances people tend to use and at what times of day, and how that segmentation happens for customers at sites, so that they can plan for this better and understand how they can get more people to behave like this. We're also looking at how appliance ownership changes consumption. So does having a fridge increase your consumption or not, and by how much? And then we're also able to do benchmarking across sites and then dig deeper into why one site versus another might be performing in a different way. And so to give some very practical examples of this, one example is freezers. So there's this hypothesis in the sector that owning an appliance like a freezer will increase consumption to the point where mini grid might become more sustainable. So we're testing this in fields. But based on some initial results from a previous pilot in field, we've been able to quantify to some degree the impact of owning a freezer versus not owning a freezer, and owning a TV versus not owning a TV. And the results are quite encouraging. So we've observed that freezer ownership increases consumption by 200 to 300% versus the baseline of somebody that doesn't own this appliance. And TVs only increase it by 50%. Of course, not everyone in a village can own a freezer versus most people can own a TV. But these getting hard numbers like this start to tell a picture of tell a story of how you can invest in different business model innovations in your site in order to improve the unit economics of the site and make mini grids more sustainable so that they can scale. Another area we can look at is not only the average consumption, but when people are consuming this power. So you can see that people with a freezer, with this red line to the right, they consume more power during the day than the average customer. And so that's better for the mini grid because that's their peak generation. And so if you can move more customers to this kind of consumption profile, you're able to more cheaply serve them their consumption. Another piece that we've looked at, as I mentioned, is the reliability of mini grids versus their main grid counterparts. Now, main grid reliability data is not readily available for every city in Africa, but the Electricity Supply Monitoring Initiative, led by the World Bank, but also many other parties, has set up monitoring in Tanzania and Kenya of various sites in the city to understand when outages occur across the city, and if that varies by the socioeconomic status of each region. So we've taken an average of Dar es Salaam connection quality and whether there is supply, whether the voltage is in normal range, or whether it's too low or too high for the rated voltage. And we've done a comparison of this. To mini grids in rural Tanzania, and the results are very encouraging. Mini grids deliver reliability that is not being delivered by the main grid. 98% reliability versus 46% normal voltage and 12% no supply at city connections in Tanzania. So this is very encouraging information for mini grid developers and the advocacy for private sector mini grids versus main grid if the main grid is not able to deliver a reliable connection. And the reason this is important is reliability is cited as a key metric for rural businesses to be able to operate effectively. So if their connection is more reliable, they lose less revenues per year than if their connection is unreliable. And then a third piece of analysis that we did was to try and estimate the addressable market for mini grids in Africa. Now, there are several models that estimate this, and we tried to come up with a least cost approach that was easy to understand for Africa based on the population of Africa today. And so we mapped the main grid in Africa using a World Bank grid infrastructure database. We set a distance from grid buffer where we said anybody within that distance from the grid is most cost effectively connected by a main grid connection, and anybody further than that distance probably should have an off-grid solution. And then we segmented the off-grid population by how dense their village was. So anybody in a dense village, we said, would be best and most cost effectively connected by a mini grid. Anybody in a sparsely populated area would be most cost effectively connected by a solar home system. And the results were quite positive, where there are populations best served by grid expansion. So 210 million people without access today are probably best served by, most cost effectively served by a grid extension. But 100 million people, and so these blue dots on the screen that you can see, these people are both most cost effectively served by mini grids, based on today's cost, today's consumption profiles, and the population in those areas currently. And then a further 300 million in the white space would be most cost effectively served by solar home systems based on the cost of connection. And so these are three examples of, the previous three slides were examples of some of the research work that we're doing. In terms of the active prototype testing that we're doing in the lab, as I already alluded to, we're working on appliance finance, and we also have a test going on tariff subsidy. And we're about to launch our next wave of prototypes through the lab over the next 2 to 3 months. And so in appliance financing, what we're really testing is, as I said, if you have appliances offered to customers on credit, will that increase their consumption enough to offset the cost of offering a credit program to these customers? And we're getting good traction on this already. So over 500 appliances have been sold across 20 sites with 4 developers in East Africa, so in Tanzania and Kenya. And we've already had interest to launch the next wave in sites in Tanzania with developers who've sold out of appliances. And then we're separately looking at running a similar program in Nigeria, and we've had developers in Nigeria, 6 of them, express interest that they'd like to deploy this prototype as soon as they can. The second prototype we've got live and actively running is tariff subsidy. And so the lab is testing whether if you lower electricity prices for rural customers, do they use more power, or is something else stopping them from using power? Now, it seems obvious that if you lower the price, consumption will go up, but we wanted to put hard data to this that we could stand behind and publish for the sector. And then we've launched this on 2 sites in Tanzania already, and we've got 3 sites in the pipeline to launch this prototype in Tanzania and Kenya. And the idea being that if we can prove that rural customers do use more electricity and benefit from that from a socioeconomic perspective, then this makes the case to governments and donors that a tariff subsidy could be an effective program or way for them to fund rural electrification. And finally, what's of interest to us or to developers to pilot next, so some of the upcoming innovations. One is testing metering technology and figuring out which one has the best performance versus the cost of that smart meter, and doing tests both in field and also benchmarking from a desktop review. Then the second one is grid integration. So this is a really exciting pilot, but very difficult to do, where you test the legal, technical, and economic feasibility of integrating an existing mini grid with main grid infrastructure. This is important as the main grid is constantly expanding, and any mini grid built today risks a grid arrival scenario in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so if we can prove that the economics of grid arrival are not catastrophic for mini grids, this could be a great evidence for the sector to start investing in areas where grid arrival could be a bigger risk, and testing whether there's a business model that works with a main grid integrated mini grid. Then a third piece we're testing is a relatively simple pilot, but if you offer Wi-Fi on sites, does this increase the revenues enough to justify the cost of offering Wi-Fi? And so these are rural areas. Having a Wi-Fi connection, especially in an area that may not have good mobile connectivity, could be transformational for businesses and for well-being. And if this can be done in an effective business setting, then it could also grow the revenues from mini grids and make them more sustainable as they expand. And then finally, we're testing a pilot on capex reduction for when sites extend. So one common issue is as people get access to electricity, they start to use more and more consumption, and the site becomes stretched based on its initial design. And so if you can add capex, add generation capacity with a modular expansion of the site, and it's cost effective based on the tariffs that they charge at the site, then that could be a great way to save upfront time when we're building new sites in estimating the sizing of the generation and storage capacity, to say we can have a storage capacity and generation put in based on a more rudimentary estimate and then expand it later, and it's still cost effective to expand it later. So that summarizes the prototypes, some of the prototypes we have in the pipeline. And basically is the end of my presentation. So happy to answer questions about our approach to innovation, how we're using technology versus how we're doing business model, prototyping, and other questions about energy access and the landscape in Africa.
Across all 4 speakers. Are you able to stay with us for that?
Sorry, what was that? I missed that.
Sorry, we're going to take Peter's presentation, and then we'll, at the end of all 4 speakers, we'll have a 15-minute session for questions. If that's okay.
Yeah, I'm planning to stay.
Okay, thank you. So Peter. Great.
Great, thanks, Ed. It's great to be here, and I'm Peter Robbins from the Open University, and I work with a set of colleagues that are here on the listed here, Dave Wield, Andrew Watkins, and Gordon Wilson. And we're from an innovation studies group. So what I'm looking at here is the kind of social factors that affect uptake and implementation of some of these technologies we've been talking about today. And I found the discussions really fascinating, and some of the stuff that I'll be talking about today kind of relates to what Lucy's just said in particular. What I'm going to start with is something brief on inclusive innovation, which is very popular within the innovation studies domain at the moment, and it's relevant to this field. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our research on engineering and international development, and the importance with implementation around networks and what I call bricolage and reflexivity, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then I'll finish up with a case study of the implementation of solar off-grid energy in South Africa. So the idea of inclusive innovation is really to try to address the idea that innovation has tended to benefit higher income consumers. And the innovation studies community, sort of realized that, and this is really a reflection on trying to bring excluded groups back into the innovation process. And to move away from this idea that innovation means something like the innovation of inequality. So it really emerges out of the appropriate technology movement from the 70s onwards, focusing on these needs of the excluded. And there are a set of factors that have allowed it kind of to unfold more recently. There's the increased participation of the private sector in these areas. The development of the poor as an accessible market, the so-called bottom of the pyramid sort of dimension. And there's growth of technological capabilities in developing countries, and growth of ICTs. You may have heard of the MP's project in Kenya, for example, and mobile phones. And this is based on Richard Heats at Manchester has done some work around this, and some this work is drawn on this research. He's created this what he calls a ladder of inclusive innovation. So there are ways in which inclusion can happen, and at the most basic is when you have inclusion of intention, of intending to be involved in an excluded group in innovation. Then there's consumption, where they can consume, where the products of innovation are used by the excluded group. Then the third level is about inclusion around impact related to people's livelihoods. And then the higher levels are about inclusion in the process of actually developing the innovation, inclusive innovations that happen within a structure that is itself inclusive, and then this idea at the top level 6 of post-structural innovation, which is about ways of thinking, knowledge frameworks, discourses of inclusion. So there's a wide scope for the ways in which inclusion can happen in the process of innovation, and this ladder is a way of beginning to think through how and where that might happen, which is quite helpful. So our work at the Open University has been around engineering and international development, and we have this growth of new journals and development of engineering, and they in this field, scholars talk about applying engineering and economic research to the problems of poverty. Engineering as a practice is, in developing country contexts, is often about keeping things working. So I think about the classic American cars in Cuba that have been kept going since the 1950s, for example. But it's also about process, better workplace practices. It's not always synonymous with innovation, but it can involve disruptive innovation, the $80 iPad, for example. And then there's also small and medium innovations that together can create disruptive transformation, such as wind and solar energy. And in this field, we often see this tension between the kind of best with best approach to engineering for developing country contexts. This is where the best departments from sort of countries in the north connect with the best researchers in the south to produce new, I don't know, PCR machines or something. And this is about more science, more theory, more discipline-based, high-tech, and then appropriate technology, which is more about addressing the needs of the poor, more practice-based, more incremental, and locally embedded. So in practice, it's not always easy to target a particular innovation around this continuum, but I think that is a kind of a tension that you see existing within the field, which is kind of interesting to explore. The way I got into this research originally was when I worked with water engineers who did a lot of work in Uganda, and what I decided, and this is picked up by others, that really this kind of work is it's engineering that's both social and technical. So increasingly you see a movement towards thinking about socio-technical dynamics, for example, instead of technology-led approaches. You see the public, or you see users as a knowledge resource rather than some group kind of to be engaged, sort of the target of an innovation. There's a process increasingly around dialogue and agreement, and also about starting from livelihoods and looking at how technologies can relate to livelihoods. Similarly, systems perspectives and partnerships between engineers and stakeholders, and looking at expertise in a kind of broad and holistic and interdisciplinary way in terms of socio-technical systems rather than designs. And I think from the cases that we've examined, the kind of engineering that works in many contexts is ones that take this kind of systemic and socially embedded interdisciplinary approach to understanding problems and solutions. A social scientist called Francis Cleaver came up with this idea of bricolage, which is a French word, which kind of means, which she refers to it in contrast to what she calls development by design. She says that development in practice is often an uneven and creative combination of patching together old and new practices and institutions to find something that works on the ground. It may be a kind of making do and adapting and shaping what's locally available. And Duncan Green, who's kind of an advocate of this idea from Oxfam, talks about it as about development as whitewater rafting rather than supertanker, where you're having to work with local systems and having to find ways of adapting technologies to local systems and dancing with the system, which I think is a very nice metaphor. The other aspect that's quite important is the strength of networks and partnerships, and this is about making use of different expertises and knowledge across various environments. So you find things that work, and these involve NGOs, obviously development organizations, businesses, and key individuals. We're working with the Royal Academy of Engineering Africa Catalyst program, and they have a very interesting program that aims to strengthen this networking around the national professional engineering bodies, the institutes of engineering, in order to eventually reach international standards like the Washington Accord. So they're creating the networks via the local professional engineering institutes. Our colleague Stephen Chapika did a case study on solar off-grid homes, and in this case, what you had was a program where South Africa has a universal access to electricity target. They have a grid-based system, and they want to address those people in rural areas who they want to bring on stream. As of 2017, there are approximately 30,000 installations. The households pay a monthly fee to cover maintenance and replacement battery costs. This monthly fee was based on the idea that local concessionaires would have a presence in the communities. They would keep things going. This program's heavily subsidized, both in terms of installing the system and subsidizing the energy costs, because many of the poorer consumers can't afford it. So it relies a lot on the subsidy to keep it going. There's been challenges in recovering costs. I think Lucy's touched on this issue via the tariff alone, and this raises questions about its sustainability ultimately. So implementation of the program has been slow, and there are challenges around political will to drive it, and also from local municipal authorities who often prioritize water and waste, for example, over other services like energy. Of course, this clean and convenient energy is important for development, for enabling women and children to study, for example. There have been problems with non-payment and maintenance. This is mainly because issues like roads to access the equipment have not been maintained, and there's also been issues with other issues with the local municipalities and making it happen. So here, this highlights the importance of these networks, where the Department of Energy, for example, in South Africa, could play a stronger coordinating role to bring together this grid expansion policy and address the related infrastructure to make it work, roads, for example. It suggested, bricolage suggested the ways in which these institutions might be adapted to address the requirements of this new particular system, and the reflexivity idea is important about flexible adaptation to these challenges as they arise. So this really touches on where these systems might be developed so that they can ensure the greatest success. So this work, this is really concludes my presentation, but these are some of the work that I've drawn on, and this is some of the publications that we've had in the area. So I draw your attention to those. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we've had 4 really interesting presentations this morning. Bernie, can we have Lucy's picture back up on here if we can?
Hi.
Hi, Lucy. Great. So we have a camera on the audience. We have a camera up on here. We also should be able to pick up questions from the audience so that you can hear them as well, Lucy. So that's really great. We've got 2 colleagues going around with the microphones. Thank you very much. So I can see some hands up already. What we'll do, like I did yesterday, though, Bernie, are there questions from the webinar audience?
Yeah. One question that's come in from the webinar audience for Lucy specifically. Somebody interested in data from rural Nigeria. I see you mentioned that you were going to get some partners in Nigeria. So if you could say a little bit about those partners and what sort of data you would anticipate being able to get from rural Nigeria that you'd be able to share with people.
Sure. So we're planning to run the appliance finance pilot that we're doing in East Africa in Nigeria. So the data we collect on the appliance financing is smart meter data, payments data, and cost data on how much the program costs to do. And then we do a baseline survey of socioeconomic data about the villages that we're working with. So it's looking like we'll do this on 10 sites. So we'll have that data for 10 sites. What we typically do with the lab is we partner with academic institutions. And then we do our own analysis for short and snappy articles, but then academic institutions support us with doing a full holistic research-based publication. And so we don't share any of the raw data beyond us and the academic groups, but we will definitely be releasing the results of that study as soon as we start getting results in.
That's fantastic, thank you. Okay, can we see a show of hands for people that want to ask questions? We'll take Colin, Tarek, and John to begin with, those 1, 2, 3. I will come to you.
Hello, Colin Bennett, Trusted Renewables. I'd like to express some delight, actually, with what Peter just said about mentioning bricolage. And the reason was that we independently came up with the same expression with my French friends. Actually, we said bricolage. Now, this is a very fine engineering discipline called built and designed in that order. And the whole point about bricolage is you quickly put bits together, and you put them together to actually show what can be done, rather than waiting for the sort of normal step-by-step thing. And you can get some quite remarkable results out of it, and I'm sure you would agree. And so our bricolage, formal definition is lash up, or breadboard, which of course is a very fine thing. And there's another, discussed this with other colleagues of mine, there's another excellent useful word for us researchers when we're always trying to seek funding, and that's called innovation theatre. Because actually what we want to do is we want to put together, and having just successfully completed the Catalyst project, which was a lot of innovation theatre, which is what early stage projects should be. The whole point about innovation theatre is that what you're trying to do is you're trying to actually inspire people's imagination to get over some of the things that can be done. And if we can work with developing countries where some very clever people will come up with some very workarounds to solve problems. And so I would say it's total delight to hear other people using the word bricolage as well.
Thank you, Colin. Tarek?
I had a question. First of all, excellent presentation. I had a question for Lucy about her work. One of the challenges we're facing in Southeast Asia with microgrids is what kind of support and or role the government be playing in the development of mini-grids, and so there are some countries who are exploring things like subsidies and those kinds of things the government will provide to mini and microgrids. But have you done any research looking at what the role of what government should have in sort of developing and implementing mini-grids, and whether there's a role, for example, for government to provide the same kind of support in the development of distribution or transmission systems to mini-grids that they do for the national grid, to help make that much more, to help that sector become more viable and more.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's two parts of government support, and one is having clear regulation for the private sector so that they know what their bounds are for operating and what the constraints are on them. And then some pieces of that regulation that are really important are things like charging cost-reflected tariffs to customers and having a clear plan for what happens if the main grid arrives, how the main grid companies get compensated for that. And so I'd say regulation is one really important piece that doesn't cost governments anything, but is a way that they can support the sector. And then the second piece that we think is absolutely essential is subsidies. And so subsidies almost feels like a bad word to say in a sector that is trying to get private sector support, but government implicitly subsidizes rural customers anyway through the main grid, because rural customers don't spend the money on consumption that it costs to connect them. It's like $1,000 or $3,000 a connection, and they're spending, they're purchasing less than 50 kilowatt hours a month on the national tariff. There's no way you can recover that cost. And so they're implicitly being subsidized by utilities. And all that we would argue is that that you have that same subsidy for mini grids, and mini grid connections can be done much cheaper than a rural extension as you get further and further away from existing infrastructure. And so that subsidy could take two forms. It could be a capex subsidy. So there are a few RBF, or results-based financing programs on the continent now. There's some teething issues with them, but results-based financing and capex subsidies are a way forward, we think, for getting that upfront finance piece there for developers to build quickly. And then the second that we're exploring with the lab is a tariff subsidy. So mini grid developers build the site, but then they get paid every, say, 6 months, 12 months based on consumption, with a tariff subsidy that gets them from the cost reflective tariff that a mini grid needs to charge to recover their cost down to whatever the national tariff might be. And we think these two ways are a more cost effective way for governments to electrify rural populations that are suited for mini grids than extending the main grid, especially if they're quite far from existing infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Lucy, actually, one thing just to add from what we've been discussing here, we had quite a lot of discussion yesterday about the governance issues in relation to mini grids. So that was both in terms of planning and needs assessment and support for that kind of process and different forms of community organisation. And the LCEDN's just actually in the process of publishing a briefing paper on that might be of interest to your group. The other issue, which we had a breakout on yesterday, was the role of local government within that context. So I think there's some quite interesting things there could be some quite interesting basis for further conversations around that, I think, about how that might fit into what you guys are already doing. So thank you. John, I think you were the third person with a question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much. I think it's a question really for both Lucy and Peter, perhaps. One of the things that we've observed in Southern Nairobi project in rural Kenya is the issue of uncertain income patterns among rural populations, which seems to be a real problem for decentralised renewable energy projects more generally, i.e. how you have sufficiently flexible, adaptable financial and business models that can take into account the fact that people do actually have the capacity to pay, but that they, let's say they're maybe a farmer and only receive actual cash money once a year when they sell a crop or something like that, and other people whose income streams is far weaker and far less stable. So my question is, innovation, both in the mini-grid sense that Lucy's talking about and Peter perhaps more generally, needs to be adapted to the lived reality of the poorest at the bottom of the pyramid in at least that respect. Financially, I wonder if both of you might be able to kind of comment on that, i.e. how do you include that lived reality, particularly as opposed to incomes and livelihoods, into patterns of mini-grids and innovation more generally.
Thank you for the question, John. Peter, do you want to take that first, and then we'll pass over to Lucy. Peter, if you want to come up and talk here, so that you'll get captured on the response.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important issue, and I think it's I don't have an immediate answer to that, but I think it's something that needs some research, because I mean, obviously the central authority in the South African case would want to support those people in that kind of situation, but it's obviously this uncertain and uneven income streams is a key challenge to these kinds of systems that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Lucy.
So I have a couple of points, and you're right that we do observe in the consumption patterns, if you remember from my slide, that actually it does dip in the drought season and then come up again in the rainy season. The consumption that people have. And so a couple of things that developers do and that we're trying to do, one is appliance finance, where you don't pay upfront for the appliance, but you pay it back over time. And so those monthly payments are a lot smaller than you otherwise would need to pay if you wanted to buy an appliance upfront. If we're doing it upfront, you'd need to wait to the harvest period, and then all your money's gone on one appliance as soon as you've earned it. So it's not so sustainable for a family. And then another thing that developers do is they don't charge high fixed rates for consumption. You buy consumption as you need it, and there's no pressure to buy more or less on any given month. And so some even charge a daily rate, where if you have money on a particular day, you buy your electricity, and if you don't have it that day, you don't buy it. And so it gives flexibility to families if they're getting pressured up until harvest to if they want their, they don't need to pay a huge monthly fee, they can use energy as and when they need it on a particular day. But it is an issue that, yeah, if you're constrained up to that point, getting access to your power. And then another piece that helps this as well is how mini grids are financed. And so if you're financing mini grids on a longer term time horizon, you don't need, for example, a solar home system expects payback within a year. Mini grids don't require that because they're projects that have a 10, 15, 20-year lifespan. And so there's no pressure to pay back the cost of connecting within that 1 year, because they know that they'll have you as a customer for 20 years. And so having that kind of finance in mini grids really helps for managing this.
Which makes them more akin to mini service providers, as opposed to the purchase of a product, which is what the household systems are.
So it's the problem of managing systems on a weekly or monthly period of people repayment. It's problematic in that if you don't have an income coming in regularly like that, you're more likely to fall out.
But I think
it's a problem for the grid as well. Because that's an imposition, it's an external imposition by donors and funders, because they want to see that regularity of income coming in. You can quite understand that, but it's a mismatch of external perception versus the payment reality of the people that they are allegedly trying.
But the interesting thing there is that in some senses, the grid and the mini grid offer some level of flexibility in people's choice of how much they want to use than a lot of the solar home system. But let's move on to other questions. We'll take some from this side. We've got 1, 2, 3 coming down here. So one behind you first, and then we'll take those 3 first. I've seen you there, Paul.
Great, from the Birmingham University. So my question is to Lucy. So how far the approach that you use to collect data, if you are using more survey, or if you are using also if you have some kind of technical solution, so to maybe using ICT, so to automatically generate so data on the consumption, or if you are using survey to collect this data. You also mentioned in one of the points the investment fund that you have as part of the project. That would be interesting to know which kind of activities are you doing through this investment fund. We will most probably have applied in Germany for a project with similar goals like your project. So looking at mini grid system and financing. I think how far are you also open to see maybe we are focusing on West Africa. And if the project is successful, I think, how far are you open for collaboration?
I don't know whether you could hear that, Lucy. Could you?
Yeah, I'm struggling to hear, so if someone could repeat the question, that would be great.
Let me see if I get this right. One is, how is the data recorded in terms of the feedback on consumption and so on? And the second, Eric, could you just explain that again?
The investment fund that you mentioned in the beginning.
More about the investment fund that you mentioned in the beginning, and also the possibilities for collaboration with a similar initiative that powers are involved in West Africa. Can we just we'll just take a couple of questions together, if that's okay, Lucy? So the next speaker.
Hello, I'm Chris Bill, researcher here in Loughborough in energy storage. I have 2 questions. The first question is going to the first speaker. I forgot the name.
Upul.
Yeah. He talked about the disadvantage of lead acid battery because of long waiting to the next cycle, charge cycle. I was just trying to think, would hybrid systems, say solar and wind, be a possible solution to that disadvantage on lead acid? The second question is about the recent developments in energy storage, in particular battery-based energy storage. We've seen a bit more of technologies coming in, the likes of hydrogen manganese, hydrogen bromide, aluminum-based batteries. But then it's more or less like there is a high response because of the increasing contribution of renewables, say in the UK. So do we hope that these advanced electrical energy storage technologies would by chance solve the problems facing maybe say the Sub-Saharan Africa? And in the respect of the ladder of inclusion, how could we place these advancements in energy storage?
Thank you. Hannah was the third question on this group.
Hello, my name is Hannah Mottram from the University of Sheffield. So Peter, it was great to hear you talking about inclusive innovation and how kind of there's kind of thing going on around thinking about social impacts and how to include people in innovation. So my question is kind of more targeted towards Jonathan and Lucy. So Jonathan, you talked about linking the technical to systems and policy. So yesterday we talked quite a lot about ecosystems approach, so I was kind of interested in what do you count as that system? Is that the broader ecosystem, including kind of community, kind of hierarchies, kind of gender, or is it a technical system? And to Lucy, you talked about methods that you kind of hope that, say, looking at storage and how that can affect social impact. So I was interested in how we're going to measure or investigate those, because you talked a lot about kind of collecting lots and lots of data points, but in terms of how you're going to collect that information on the social impacts of the innovative business models.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask respondents to keep these relatively brief so we can fit in one more round of questions, if that's okay? So Lucy, let's turn to you first, and then I'll pass over to others.
So I'll bundle my two questions together because there's one on data. So for the consumption and payments data, we capture that raw from smart meter and associated platforms. So that's very easy for us to then take and process. And then for the social impact measurements, the way we're doing it currently is in-field surveys of the sites where we're working. We take a baseline before we do the intervention, if you like, and then we do a midline sometimes, but not always. And then we do an end-line survey where we assess the impact post the intervention. We try and cover as many people aside as possible, but get a good sample size so that we have meaningful results. And then in terms of the doing this in West Africa, we're very open to new partners. We're currently working in Nigeria with developers there, and we seek to work with people who are already mini-grid companies rather than people trying to demonstrate a new pilot as their first as a mini-grid company, but open to collaboration, so feel free to reach out after the session.
Brilliant. Upul, would you like to come up?
So I'm glad that you asked that question. Nobody's in technology. So yes, the second, I will answer the second question first. So yes, the new technologies do answer, and they are promising. In particular, you mentioned quite a few technologies. In particular, they are emerging ecosystem batteries, ecosystem batteries, and we see you can expand voltage windows about 4 volts right now in some ecosystems, which is something that would deal with the condition of just water. First, I didn't get your first question. So when you mentioned hybrid PV on solar wind, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Because in your explanation, you didn't get that one of the problems with grid acid is that there is a long wait to the next check cycle, for example.
Yeah.
So I was thinking of this.
Yes, if you have the right demographic and the right conditions, yes, it should be. But again, you could have the right conditions, and then the nature always will provide that to us always. Yeah.
Jonathan.
Thanks. So I think the first question from back was around whether the technologies that we're developing will happen to be the right ones in other situations. I think the risk is, well, that's not necessarily the case, but the risk is we develop lithium-ion batteries to meet electric vehicle demands, and then we start putting them in situations where maybe they're not the optimal sort of technology. And I think that's what I want to get away from, is considering that the system needs and the user needs for technologies as the basis for what we deploy. And I think that brings us into the second question is what sort of system are we looking at? Well, partly, a lot of the time we put in technologies without being aware of the system consequences. So we start to think about the energy system now and how we can provide a more efficient, low carbon system. But we're also much more interested in the wider social benefits that fits into. So, the example I was giving about Mexico and a community that's looking to bring water up to the village, and the impact that has on gender imbalances within that village are just as important. So that's part of the sort of multi-criteria decision approach that we're looking at.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Right, we'll take one more round of questions. Can we keep these to one sentence? Okay. So put your hand down if you've got. I think it's going to take longer than that. If we go around all of the hands that are up, and then we'll go around the speakers one more time. Can you keep your hands up? So actually, right, no, that's going to take too long.
I want to find out on your innovation labs, have you done any work looking to see if the trade could be based on not cash, so really barter trade, so it's something that is social, that is produced locally for electricity instead of cash where cash may not be available option.
Did you catch that, Lucy, or not?
I didn't catch much of that except
Okay,
cash.
so the question is whether there is, whether you have explored the use of barter trade or locally produced materials in place of cash payments. But we'll come, if you could come back to that, which is next question.
My question is for the parts. So I wanted to ask first if there's an analysis between the battery chemistries and the economic, the costs of the chemistry. And then number two, to add on the question that someone else asked, is there like a hybrid between lithium ion and lead acid, which, is there a possibility for that hybrid to deal with the length of time to the next charge and also the cost generally of having a very reliable storage system?
Okay, next question. So I saw Stuart's hand was up.
Hi, I'm also interested in technology. I wonder about the deployment of flow batteries in sort of the global south. How much uptake for that, like right now, for the Scottish community projects we're starting to see them appearing, and there is some parallels, but it's not the same climatic conditions. So
that was a long sentence. Yeah, well, yeah.
Hi, I'm from International. Question against Lucy. Just around, you mentioned RDF, and I was just wondering, are you aware of any other innovative financial instruments that are out there to help support green developers? And what's the kind of interest that you're seeing coming in from private and commercial level investors into the green market in Africa right now? And in what form?
And there's another question down at the front here. So this will be the last question. Okay.
They
better be. Oh, it's going up.
So, for this, in your financing, why a freezer? And if just the household who make the decision between the freezer. Secondly, is there any correlation between the increased expenditure and the increase in income expenses line for the household? For either, I think in one of your slides you mentioned about the need for private sector concession for maintenance. At what rate? I think it will not be good for the impoverished rural communities to be financing, let's say, the pounds per day for maintenance. Could we cut a certain percentage as a CSR from that private sector? Thank you.
Okay, that's all of the questions. So let's go through the speakers in order. So Upul, if you want to go first.
Yes, I'll take one by one. So the first one is about flow batteries. Yes, in the UK we had, in fact, we had an industrial plant, EDF, flow battery systems here in Indian companies. There are positives and pros and cons, especially in large-scale set applications in the world, in terms of responsives and then maintenance and all the other cost infrastructure and then know-how, skills of maintenance. So we need to take all large package and then see how the different scenarios can be mitigated for microgrids, etc. So that needs to be balanced. Yes, I would say that it has a potential. So there's the other questions about hybrid, combining hybrid with battery, lead acid and lithium, I guess. Now, imagine that if you couple two different scenarios, like say if you put two tires in the vehicle, one is F1 tire and the other one is normal ordinary tire, we can't expect that vehicles to go as fast as F1. So there are the metrics and different scenarios are different for these two technologies. So that's why I said it is so important that we develop a library or a toolkit taking different technology scenarios as well as the other supporting scenarios in financing, etc., and find the best match.
You're asking to put together,
yeah.
Asking integrate, so you install a lead acid and a lithium ion, right? You find a way to kind of schedule them so that when this one is at 40%,
right,
you switch off the ion.
Yeah, I guess it is something that someone really need to look at in detail. I can't tell you exactly in my head that what's going on. But clearly, if you remember some of the schematics I showed, they are catering different scenarios. They have the cross solution with different scenarios. And so somehow, I guess they are, if you look at in detail, they can be really down somewhere in certain cases.
That sounds like a discussion over coffee to me. So, Jonathan?
Thanks. I'll just quickly come back to Stuart's point, but I think it's absolutely right. I mean, a lot of this discourse is around batteries, because we've got batteries, we're developing batteries here, and we're thinking about how to finance them into smart grids in a developing country. Whereas we should be thinking about, what are the needs of those, the populations or the communities, and think about what technological innovation could help meet those needs, because it's not always going to be batteries, and flow batteries are different sort of technology. It could be thermal storage, hot or cold if people want heating or cooling, or other types of large-scale energy storage for balancing. So I think that's a really important point that we should be looking more broadly at the technological options.
I think that's a conversation you should be having with charity, actually, wherever she is, in terms of Jonathan, charity's company already using different forms of storage in Kenya. Actually, Lucy, just to use chair's prerogative for a moment, kind of building on that, storage didn't appear to be an issue that you particularly focused on thus far. Is that because it's not something that the developers you're working with are particularly concerned about?
So they haven't raised it as being game-changing for their business model over the next 3 months worth of our testing, but they did flag having different types of battery storage that were more reliable might be something to do in the future. And I guess with developers, they always have backup generation with diesel. So battery storage is obviously very important for them because it's lower cost to have battery storage than diesel, but they do have a way to solve that problem from a business perspective if they do run out of storage, and they can still meet their needs with the customers. So it hasn't been raised as a big issue yet, but it could be in the future.
Okay. Do you want to take the other questions that you were asked then?
Yes. So I'll start with the question on finance. We focus on this a lot as private sector advisors, and we are actually raising a fund for mini grids, so project finance facility. And so in terms of other financing mechanisms besides an RBF, so RBF is kind of government or donor-led, whereas we see a big gap in private sector asset class investment into mini-grids. So mini-grids kind of have the risk of VC investment, but the payback periods of infrastructure assets. And so project finance is a way that you can invest in mini-grids and take the assets off the balance sheet so that VC investors can invest in the company itself and the high growth in the company, but then mini-grids as an asset can get the returns for the types of infrastructure investments that will be attracted, investors that will be attracted to those returns. And then the way that we're de-risking that for the initial round of investors is this is a new way of investing in mini-grid infrastructure, is we're working with donors to have a blended finance mechanism. So they take on, they don't expect as high a return or even no return versus private sector companies that are part of the fund that do expect a meaningful return, and that de-risks it for them, such that the private sector companies are able to take that return over other investors in the capital stack. But we would say that like project finance for energy infrastructure is not anything new. Obviously, infrastructure investment has happened for the 6 billion people who do have access to electricity around the world. And so it's just about getting it right for mini grids in Africa, given the different risk profile and the scenario for rural customers here. And so I missed the first question from the previous, the last person who asked questions, but I heard the question on, is there correlation with increased expenditure and increasing incomes? We're not sure yet on that second question, because the data hasn't been collected on the appliance financing pilot. If their consumption goes up, does their income go up? But a hypothesis for us would be that if you're buying a productive appliance like a freezer or like a subwoofer and TV system for an entire community, then yes, incomes should go up. But we haven't got the data for that to support that yet. And okay. I missed the first question, but
we're running late actually, so I'm going to move on to Peter. Thank you, Lucy.
Okay. So very briefly on the financing of the program, so the central government financing subsidy is significant. It's 80% of the cost of the system, with the rest is financed by the concessionaire. So the cost to install the system is about at $740, and customers pay an upfront fee of $13 when they receive the system, and then they have to pay a monthly service fee of $8. And because that's too expensive for many customers, there's a consumption subsidy of about $5 paid out to the local municipality directly to the concessionaires, and so this ends up being free basic electricity subsidy for customers that ends up being about 50 kilowatt hours free per month.
Thank you very much. Right, I think I'm sorry to bring things to a close. I can see that there's a lot of real interest in this. Do talk to our speakers over coffee. Unfortunately, Lucy, that doesn't extend to you, but hopefully next time you'll be able to come and join us in person for the next one of these that we do. Sure. Can we say a big thank you to all of our speakers again, please? And just a quick announcement locally is that after the coffee break, which we will extend slightly, there are 3 sessions to choose from. The energy justice session, which I think Ben is now going to lead because Britta is unwell in here. The mini grid game session will be in the Turing, which is the other big ground floor room. And the challenges and opportunities in delivery models session will be upstairs in the room upstairs. So enjoy your coffee and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody. The next session, which is going to be broadcast, will be at 9 o'clock UK time tomorrow morning, Friday the 1st of June. Thank you for joining us on this one. Goodbye.